Hello everyone. Tonight we are traveling far back in time, over 1,000 years ago, to a rugged land shaped by mountains, rivers and the sea. This was the Korean Peninsula, a place where kingdoms rose and fell, and where ambition often clashed with survival. Don't worry, you won't have to swing a sword tonight. I'll do the storytelling. And you just have to lie there and stay awake long enough to find out who wins. But be warned. If you fall asleep too soon, you might wake up, not knowing whether Baekje, Goguryeo or Silla took over the land. And trust me, your friends won't forgive you for missing that trivia question. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you really like what I do here. And I'd love for you to leave a comment telling me where you are listening from and what time it is for you. I always imagine these stories traveling across the globe, maybe someone in Seoul, someone in California, someone else in Paris, all drifting off together to the same history. Now turn off the lights, maybe turn on the fan for some soft background music, and let's get started tonight. The Korean Peninsula was not a simple place to live in the ancient world. It was rugged and mountainous, with thick forests, rushing rivers, and harsh winters. These natural barriers didn't just shape the daily lives of the people, they shaped politics and war. Small tribal confederations had dotted the land for centuries, but over time, stronger groups began to rise, pushing the weaker ones aside. From these struggles came three kingdoms that would dominate the peninsula for centuries: Baekje in the Chulti southwest, Goguryeo in the north, and Silla in the southeast. At first glance you might imagine these kingdoms as three brothers sitting at the dinner table, except instead of passing the rice politely, they were constantly smacking each other with chopsticks. Baekje, with its fertile plains, was rich in agriculture and culture. Goguryeo, up in the north, was a fortress kingdom, toughened by constant clashes with Chinese dynasties. And Silla? Well, Silla looked small and unthreatening, tucked away, behind mountains. But, as history teaches us, the smallest sibling often grows up to be the trickiest one. Historians still debate whether these kingdoms rose purely from local tribal structures, or whether Chinese influence pushed them into forming more centralized states. But what's clear is that by the 1st century CE, each of the three had established their capitals, rulers, and armies. They weren't just tribes anymore, they were nations in the making. One odd little detail from this early period is that many rulers of Goguryeo claimed descent from an egg. Yes, an egg. Imagine being introduced at a royal banquet. This is His Majesty, born of the sacred egg. That's one way to make sure nobody asks too many questions about your family tree. But these mythic stories gave rulers divine legitimacy, which was crucial when trying to convince farmers and warriors to obey. The people of the peninsula lived simple but hard-working lives. Farmers grew millet, barley, and later rice in the southern regions. Hunters tracked wild boar and deer through the mountains. Craftsmen carved wood, shaped clay pots, and smelted bronze weapons. In these daily struggles, people probably weren't too concerned about who was king. They were more concerned about whether their roofs would survive the winter. But when kings wanted soldiers, peasants often had no choice but to march to war. And wars came quickly. the three kingdoms didn't
emerge in peace. They were born through centuries of rivalry.
Baekje clashed with Goguryeo over fertile river valleys. Goguryeo raided into Silla's territory, testing its defences. And Silla, while seemingly weak, quietly forged alliances to keep itself alive. This triangle of power would define the peninsula. For centuries, three kingdoms, each too strong to fall easily and too ambitious to ever settle for peace. But let's pause for a moment here. Imagine the Korean peninsula itself like a chessboard. The mountains are the black squares blocking movement and making life difficult. The rivers are the white squares guiding trade and communication. Baekje, Goguryeo and Silla were like three players all trying to play chess at the same time on the same board. Spoiler, it didn't end peacefully and there were no checkmates, just a lot of broken pieces. One curious thing that sets these kingdoms apart from many others is how quickly they connected with outside civilizations. Even in these early centuries, Baekje and Goguryeo were trading and borrowing from China, bringing in writing systems, Buddhist monks and new technologies. And in turn, Baekje would later send scholars to Japan, helping shape Japanese culture. It's a reminder that no matter how fierce the wars on the peninsula became, ideas flowed more easily than soldiers. Still, war was inevitable. The peninsula's geography funneled its people into conflict. Fertile lands were limited, and mountain passes made strategic choke points. Whoever held the rivers and valleys held the future. And so the story of the three kingdoms wasn't just about kings and crowns. It was about survival, about who could grow enough rice to feed an army, and who could build walls strong enough to withstand an invasion. As the centuries rolled forward, Baekje would blossom, Goguryeo would flex its iron grip, and Silla would quietly bide its time. But in this opening chapter, remember this. The three kingdoms were like three fires on the same mountain. One blaze could easily spread to consume the others. And tonight, as you drift deeper into the story, think of the peninsula under a starlit sky, fires flickering in distant villages, warriors sharpening spears by torchlight, and kings dreaming of conquest. The stage was set. The war for supremacy was only just beginning. Goguryeo did not waste time being shy about its ambitions. Sitting up in the northern reaches with mountains as its armor and the great plains stretching toward China, it grew into a military powerhouse. If Baekje was the artist and Silla the patient strategist, Goguryeo was the heavyweight boxer who didn't care if his punches broke the furniture. From the early centuries, Goguryeo had already been trading blows with Chinese dynasties. For a kingdom still finding its footing, that was like picking a fight with the biggest kid on the playground. But somehow Goguryeo managed to hold its ground. Its fortresses were built into cliffs and mountainsides, impossible to take without heavy losses. Its cavalry could sweep across the plains like a thunderstorm, then vanish back into the rugged terrain. One of the strangest little details from this era is that Goguryeo soldiers were said to paint their faces before battle. Imagine an entire army showing up with bright designs across their cheeks. Intimidating, yes, but maybe also confusing. You'd be standing there thinking, are they here to fight us or join a medieval art festival? Still, it worked. The psychological effect made their enemies hesitate, which was often all Goguryeo needed. Historians still debate whether Goguryeo's rise was purely due to its geography or whether its kings simply had a talent for centralizing power. But what's not in dispute is that by the 4th century, Goguryeo was no longer just a local kingdom, it was a regional power, and with regional power came regional problems. Its favorite sparring partner was Baekje to the southwest. Baekje had fertile fields and access to the sea, while Goguryeo had military might. The two clashed repeatedly like two neighbors fighting over the best fishing spot. Every few years one side would raid the other, burn a fortress, or seize a border valley. And because maps weren't exactly crystal clear back then, the border kept shifting like a stubborn line drawn in the sand. Silla, meanwhile, tried to stay out of the mess. From its protected valleys in the southeast, it looked a bit like the kid hiding behind the couch while the older siblings fought. But don't underestimate Silla's caution. It was learning, watching, waiting. Sometimes not being punched in the nose right away is the best strategy. One humorous story that survives from this time tells of a Goguryeo king sending envoys to a Chinese court. The Chinese emperor expected humility, perhaps even gifts. Instead, the Goguryeo envoy boldly declared that his kingdom was equal to China. You can imagine the room going quiet, chopsticks frozen mid-air, while the Chinese court tried to process that statement. Equal to China? In the 4th century? That was like declaring your small-town baseball team was ready to face the Yankees. But it shows just how much confidence, or bravado, Goguryeo carried. And their confidence was not entirely misplaced. Goguryeo controlled a vast territory stretching from Manchuria down into the Korean peninsula. Its armies were professional and disciplined, often numbering in the tens of thousands. Its walls were legendary, so strong that later Chinese armies would struggle to crack them. Still, the rise of Goguryeo put pressure on everyone else. Baekje had to defend its rivers and plains. Silla had to shore up its alliances. Even the nomadic tribes on the steppes had to think twice before riding too close. In many ways, Goguryeo's aggressive expansion forced the other kingdoms to get serious about survival. Without Goguryeo breathing down their necks, Baekje and Silla might have stayed comfortable little kingdoms. Instead, they were pushed into
an arms race. And let's be honest, if you were a farmer in this time, you probably didn't appreciate being caught in this arms race. You'd just finished planting your barley, and suddenly a messenger rode in shouting that the king needed
soldiers for a campaign against Baekje. There went your harvest. The irony is that the kingdoms fought for farmland, but in doing so they often trampled the very fields they were fighting over. Another curious twist in this period is that Goguryeo wasn't just about swords and spears. It also became a cultural center. Monks traveled through, Buddhism took root, and scholars began recording history. It's almost like the kingdom had two personalities, fierce warrior by day, thoughtful philosopher by night. That balance helped Goguryeo leave a legacy that lasted long after its fortresses crumbled. Yet despite all its strength, cracks were always there. Internal struggles over succession, rival aristocratic clans, and the endless drain of war kept the kingdom from ever feeling secure. It's one thing to fight China or Baekje. It's another to keep your own nobles from plotting against you during dinner. By the end of this period, Goguryeo stood tall, its borders wide, its armies feared. But as history shows, the higher the peak, the harsher the fall. For now, though, Goguryeo's rise set the stage for an even more brutal contest. The three kingdoms were awake, alert, and ready. And somewhere in the mountains, perhaps on a moonlit night, a Goguryeo scout kept watch over the valley below, knowing that Baekje warriors were out there sharpening blades and waiting for their chance. If Goguryeo was the thunder in the north, then Baekje was the golden glow of the southwest. Nestled along fertile plains and river valleys, Baekje found its strength not only in battle, but in culture, trade, and charm. Picture it, while Goguryeo was building fortresses on mountainsides, Baekje was busy sending ships across the Yellow Sea, exchanging goods, ideas, and maybe a few secret recipes. By the 4th and 5th centuries, Baekje had blossomed into a true powerhouse. Its location gave it an edge, rivers that fed the land, access to the sea for trade, and just enough distance from the northern chaos to breathe easily, well, most of the time. If Goguryeo loved to punch, Baekje loved to paint. Its kings sponsored art, architecture, and the spread of Buddhism. Some historians even say Baekje's cultural achievements traveled as far as Japan, influencing temple design and writing systems. Imagine your neighbor asking to borrow a cup of sugar, and instead you hand them an entire philosophy. But let's not mistake Baekje for a gentle poet. Oh no, it had teeth. Its warriors fought fiercely, and its leaders were ambitious. At its height, Baekje's kings dreamed of uniting the peninsula under their banner, sending armies into the heartlands, and raiding Goguryeo's borders whenever opportunity knocked. One particularly dramatic episode came under King Gunchago, who turned Baekje from a promising player into a dominant kingdom. His reign was like the golden age of a rock band. The songs were loud, the crowds were cheering, and everyone knew their name. And yet, even during Baekje's golden days, odd little details slipped into the record. For example, one text claims Baekje courtiers wore silk robes dyed in dazzling colors, while soldiers carried banners embroidered with dragons. Dragons! Picture a battlefield where soldiers are yelling and swords are clashing, and someone's trying not to trip over a majestic silk banner. That's equal parts intimidating and impractical. One good gust of wind and you've got a flagpole disaster on your hands. Historians still debate whether Baekje's influence in Japan was exaggerated by later chroniclers, or whether it truly shaped the island's early culture. But we know there were exchanges, envoys, monks, even artisans travelling across the sea. In some ways, Baekje's golden age wasn't just about territory, it was about exporting identity, making sure their ideas outlasted their armies. Of course, nothing golden lasts forever. For all its culture and charm, Baekje faced constant pressure. Goguryeo loomed to the north, expanding and snarling, while Silla quietly fortified itself to the east. And let's be real, if you're stuck between a war-hungry giant and a patient schemer, life isn't going to stay peaceful. Still, Baekje's kings played the game with finesse. They used alliances like a gambler shuffling cards, sometimes joining with Silla against Goguryeo, sometimes even negotiating with Chinese dynasties for support. In politics, they were as slippery as fish in a river. One joke might be, if Baekje had a motto, it would be, "Why fight alone when you can get someone else to do the heavy lifting?" The ordinary people of Baekje lived in the middle of this balancing act. Farmers tilled their fields along the fertile riverbanks. Artisans worked clay and bronze into elegant vessels, and monks chanted in temples that rose above the countryside. Every time an army marched through, they probably sighed and muttered, "Here we go again." And yet the kingdom thrived, pulling resources from its land and wealth from its trade routes. One quirky fact is that Baekje had a reputation for
elegant speech.
Neighboring kingdoms apparently admired its diplomats for their refined language, as if they'd been trained at some kind of ancient charm school. Imagine being conquered by soldiers who shouted poetry as they stormed your fortress. That's Baekje's paradox, warriors with silk sleeves. By the end of Baekje's golden age, the kingdom was radiant but vulnerable. Culture gave it prestige, trade gave it wealth, and diplomacy gave it connections. But prestige doesn't always stop arrows, and silk robes don't block swords. The stage was being set for Baekje to clash harder than ever with Goguryeo, and, eventually, to deal with the quiet but cunning rise of Silla. For now, though, Baekje basked in its moment of glory, rivers gleaming in the sunlight, temples ringing with bells, and ships setting sail toward faraway shores. It was a golden glow that lit up the peninsula, even if storm clouds were already gathering on the horizon. While Goguryeo roared from the mountains and Baekje shone along the rivers, Silla quietly sharpened its tools in the southeast. It wasn't glamorous at first. Silla began as the smallest of the three, tucked away in the rugged valleys and coastlines. If Goguryeo was the boxer and Baekje the artist, Silla was the chess player. And like any good chess player, it took its time. In the early centuries, Silla looked modest. Its rulers wore simple crowns and ruled over lands far less fertile than Baekje's river valleys, but modesty can be deceiving. Beneath the surface, Silla was organizing, standardizing, and building the kind of foundation that would outlast kingdoms drunk on their own glory. Farmers dug into the stubborn soil, warriors trained in disciplined ranks, and leaders quietly consolidated authority. Silla was like that quiet kid in school who you never expect much from, until suddenly they're running the whole group project. One of Silla's great strengths lay in its adaptability. It absorbed elements of surrounding cultures, including Chinese innovations and Buddhist teachings, weaving them into something distinctly its own. Buddhism especially took root, transforming not only temples but also Silla's political identity. The kings began styling themselves as protectors of both the land and the Dharma, which made for an excellent PR campaign: divine duty plus earthly power. A curious detail from Silla's rise is its elaborate golden crowns. Unlike Baekje's silken charm or Goguryeo's stone fortresses, Silla crafted crowns of gold that sprouted antler-like branches and delicate pendants. Were they practical? Absolutely not. Imagine trying to walk through a doorway with a crown shaped like a small forest on your head, but symbolic? Oh yes. These crowns announced, We may look small, but we have the shine of kings. Some historians still debate whether the crowns were worn in everyday ceremonies or saved for burial, but either way they've become icons of Silla's ambition. Of course, ambition requires a bit of strategy, and Silla mastered that art. Instead of picking fights it couldn't win, Silla often played its rivals against one another. When Goguryeo pressed Baekje too hard, Silla offered a polite smile and stepped back, waiting for both to tire themselves out. Later, Silla forged alliances with powers like the Tang dynasty in China, proving that sometimes brains really do beat brawn. That's not to say Silla lacked warriors. Its fighting men were disciplined and proud, organized into elite groups like the Warang, an order of young aristocrats trained in both combat and culture. Think of them as the medieval equivalent of a boy band that could also swing swords. They practiced martial skills, studied poetry, and followed codes of honor. If you ever wondered what happens when you mix knights with theater kids, Silla had the answer. Life for ordinary Silla citizens was steadier than in the flashier kingdoms. Farmers worked terraced fields, fishermen combed the coasts, and artisans forged tools with quiet precision. There weren't as many dazzling silks as in Baekje, but there was resilience. And when armies marched through, well, at least the neighbors were usually the ones getting smashed first. Silla often let Goguryeo and Baekje drain each other before stepping in with a polite but firm, "Our turn now." One odd footnote in Silla history comes from an account that its early leaders used to hold court wearing robes decorated with animal motifs, tigers, dragons, and birds. Whether this was for religious ritual or just a flair for dramatic fashion, we may never know. But imagine a council meeting where every noble looks like they raided the costume section of a theatre. Intimidating? Perhaps. Fabulous? Definitely. By the 6th century, Silla was no longer a quiet background player. It was forming strong internal systems, carving alliances and gathering strength. Its leaders had the patience of fishermen casting nets into the sea, waiting for the perfect catch. And in the great game of the three kingdoms, patience was going to be the deadliest weapon of all. So while Goguryeo thundered and Baekje gleamed, Silla smiled from the southeast, biding its time. A kingdom that started as the smallest was steadily building toward a destiny no one yet expected. And if history has taught us anything, it's that underestimating the quiet ones usually ends badly. If the three kingdoms were a family dinner, this is the part where everyone starts flinging food across the table. Alliances in ancient Korea weren't about trust or friendship. They were about survival, strategy, and the occasional, well, I dislike them slightly less than I dislike you. And in this chaotic triangle, the alliances shifted like sand dunes in the wind. At different times, Baekje would link arms with Silla to face Goguryeo. Other times, Silla would sneak behind, Baekje's back and whisper deals to Goguryeo. Then, when no one was looking, one kingdom would change sides entirely. If you've ever tried to follow the plot of a long-running TV drama, you'll know exactly how historians feel trying to map out these tangled allegiances. One of the earliest major alliances was between Baekje and Silla. On paper, it made sense. Goguryeo was the heavyweight, pressing hard from the north, so naturally the two smaller kingdoms teamed up. Together they could push back against Goguryeo's stone-walled might. For a while the alliance held. Baekje lent its flair, and Silla its discipline, and together they pushed northward like an unlikely buddy-cop duo. But as with most buddy-cop duos, arguments soon broke out. Who controlled which territory? Who got credit for the victories? And, most importantly, who looked cooler while doing it? Spoiler: Baekje claimed it was them. The friction grew, and before long the alliance crumbled. It turns out that when two kingdoms team up out of necessity rather than love, it's not built to last. Meanwhile, Goguryeo wasn't just sitting around twiddling its swords. It was forging alliances of its own, including connections with nomadic tribes to the north. These alliances gave Goguryeo added manpower and mobility, allowing them to strike deep into enemy territory when the mood struck. And the mood struck often. The most dramatic shift came when Silla, once Baekje's ally, flipped sides and reached out to Goguryeo. This alliance startled everyone, much like when your quiet friend suddenly shows up at a party with the wildest guest in town. But here's the kicker: it wasn't built on trust, but on calculation. Silla saw Baekje getting too strong and thought, why not let Goguryeo soften them up for us? Of course, alliances weren't just made in Korea. Each kingdom was aware of the looming presence of China's dynasties, first the Wei, then the Sui, and later the Tang. These powerful neighbors were both a threat and a resource. Baekje and Goguryeo often traded envoys to Chinese courts, seeking recognition or military support. Silla, too, sent emissaries, carefully cultivating relationships that would eventually pay off in spectacular ways. One odd, almost comedic, detail comes from records of alliance negotiations. Banquets. Apparently, whenever two kingdoms sat down to discuss treaties, they feasted as if the outcome depended on the number of pigs roasted that day. And in a way, maybe it did. After all, nothing smooths over political distrust quite like a shared plate of grilled meat. Still, historians debate whether these lavish spreads symbolized unity or just an excuse for aristocrats to show off their wine collections. The tangled web of alliances kept shifting throughout the centuries, creating a constant air of suspicion. No one ever really knew who was a friend and who was a temporary tool. You could share a battlefield with an ally one year and face them as an enemy the next, which, let's be honest, must have made family reunions at court a little awkward. Through all this, the people, the farmers, craftsmen, and villagers, probably just rolled their eyes. To them, alliances meant that one year they were told to fight for Baekje, the next year for Silla. It was less about loyalty and more about survival. And if you've ever tried to keep track of three kingdoms constantly reshuffling teams, you'll know that even the villagers probably gave up halfway and muttered, "Wake me up when one side wins." Still, these alliances were not wasted effort. Each pact, no matter how short-lived, carved the map of the peninsula in new ways. Each betrayal shaped strategies and ambitions, and in the constant shifting, the stage was set for the real showdown to come, because in the end, the three kingdoms weren't just maneuvering against each other, they were maneuvering toward destiny. And as history shows us, destiny rarely plays nice. If you've ever watched three siblings fight over who gets the last dumpling, you'll have a pretty good idea of what the wars of the three kingdoms looked like, except replace the dumpling with entire provinces and the squabbling with spears, arrows, and flaming siege engines. These were not skirmishes in the backyard. These were wars that scarred the Korean peninsula for centuries, leaving marks still visible in its archaeology, its culture, and frankly, its collective memory. The first waves of conflict were usually border wars. Goguryeo pressed southward, hungry for fertile plains and river valleys. Baekje tried to hold its ground while simultaneously reaching north, claiming that its warriors deserved just as much farmland. Meanwhile, Silla quietly expanded eastward and then found itself dragged into conflicts when neighbors encroached. The land itself, rivers, hills, trade routes, became the real prize, fought over again and again like a piece of fabric being tugged from three directions until it nearly tore apart. One major clash came during the reign of King Goguryeo of Goguryeo, who lived up to his title as Broad Expander of Territory. His campaigns stretched far beyond Goguryeo's borders, crushing Baekje forces and leaving scars that lingered for generations. Baekje responded in kind with ferocious counterattacks and raids that sometimes burned entire towns. And Silla, well, Silla often played the cautious fox, watching, waiting, and only jumping in when the opportunity looked irresistible. It wasn't just brute force, though. These wars brought in new strategies, ambushes in mountain passes, naval raids along riverbanks, and sieges where wooden towers crept toward stone fortresses like very slow but very deadly snails. To modern eyes, it all seems like a medieval game of Risk, but to those living through it, the wars meant starvation, destroyed harvests, and the constant drumbeat of conscription. And here's an odd detail. In the heat of these battles, animals often became part of the spectacle. Horses, of course, were essential, but some records mention war dogs trained to charge enemy lines. Imagine trying to hold a shield wall while a pack of snarling dogs barrels toward you. It adds a whole new layer of nope to ancient combat. Historians still debate whether these accounts are exaggerated, but the idea alone paints a vivid picture. For the people on the ground, the wars were endless cycles of rebuilding and destruction. Villagers fortified their hamlets with wooden palisades, only to see them knocked down within a season. Farmers sowed fields that were trampled flat by marching armies. Whole populations were uprooted and resettled by conquering kings. To live in the three kingdoms was to know that war might show up at your doorstep like an uninvited guest who never, ever left. But wars also forged legends. Tales of heroes spread, men who could supposedly split helmets with a single swing, or who fought on even after arrows pierced their armor. And yes, it's fair to assume the stories grew taller with each retelling. Still, these legends gave hope, and they offered kingdoms propaganda material, because nothing inspires troops quite like hearing that some warrior supposedly fought 10 men at once and still had time to comb his beard afterward. Of course, these wars weren't always decisive. Battles often ended with no clear victor, just exhausted armies trudging home with fewer men than they started. Sometimes victories were so costly that they felt suspiciously like defeats, and sometimes alliances collapsed mid-battle, leaving one side betrayed in the middle of the field. You can almost imagine soldiers groaning, "Not again!" One particularly brutal conflict was the Battle of Gwansan Fortress in 554 CE, where Baekje and Silla forces clashed head-on. The result? Silla emerged victorious, but Baekje lost its king and much of its military strength. It was the kind of battle that shifted the balance of power, at least temporarily. And that's the thing about these wars. Nothing stayed the same for long. One year, Goguryeo looked unstoppable. The next year, Baekje struck back. And the year after that, Silla suddenly snatched up territory while no one was watching. It was as if the peninsula itself couldn't decide who it belonged to, passing from one set of rulers to another in a constant, exhausting loop. Through all of this, the land bore the marks. Archaeologists today still uncover scorched layers of soil, broken weapons, and ruined fortresses. Each is a reminder that for centuries war was not an occasional tragedy. It was the constant background noise of life in the three kingdoms. And yet out of this chaos something remarkable was building. The scars of war were painful, yes, but they were also shaping the kingdoms into hardened states, more centralized and more determined than ever. Each war, each betrayal, each victory carved them into something stronger and something destined to clash again. Because in the world of Baekje, Goguryeo and Silla, peace was always just the pause before the next storm. If you thought the wars between Baekje, Goguryeo and Silla were messy enough, just wait until you add foreign powers into the mix. Because what's better than three kingdoms fighting each other? Three kingdoms fighting each other and inviting their bigger, scarier neighbors to join in. Yes, dear listeners, this was the moment when China and Japan decided to play referee, or more accurately, opportunistic meddler. China's involvement came mostly through the dynasties ruling at the time. Goguryeo often clashed with Chinese states, particularly the Northern Wei and later the Tang dynasty, but it also borrowed from them military technology, political organization, even fancy new fashions for the royal court. It was a bit of a love-hate relationship, like borrowing sugar from your neighbor and then setting their fence on fire the next day. Baekje, on the other hand, looked eastward across the sea. Japan, then, in its early Yamato state, became a crucial ally. Baekje princes travelled to Japan, Buddhist monks carried scriptures over the waves, and weapon shipments moved back and forth. In return, Japan gained not only cultural treasures, but also a sense of legitimacy, as Baekje's endorsement was like getting a gold star from the cool kid in class. Of course, Japan didn't send all this help out of pure generosity. They were also eyeing influence on the peninsula because power loves expansion. And then there was Silla, the quiet manipulator. At first, it stayed mostly isolated, building its own strength, but eventually it courted Chinese dynasties with diplomatic gestures and carefully timed tributes. Picture Silla sending a delegation bearing gifts, all smiles while whispering under its breath, "Please back us up against
those other guys."
When the Tang dynasty rose to prominence, Silla saw its golden opportunity and jumped at the alliance. What's strange about these interactions is how deeply they shaped culture, not just war. For instance, Baekje's influence on Japan went far beyond swords and helmets. Baekje scholars introduced writing systems, Buddhist art, and architecture that helped transform early Japanese society. Imagine Japan opening a package from Baekje. Inside, a shiny new temple design, a few sutras, and, oh look, instructions for a pagoda. That's a pretty good trade deal. At the same time, Goguryeo absorbed heavy doses of Chinese influence. Its fortresses began to resemble Chinese military designs with more sophisticated walls and gates. Officials wore imported silk, drank imported wine, and sometimes even hired Chinese scribes. Historians still debate whether Goguryeo leaned too heavily on its big neighbor, but no one doubts the impact. One odd tidbit? Records mention that Baekje once sent a group of artisans to Japan, including blacksmiths, weavers, and even a man who knew how to make fine paper. Yes, a paper expert was part of foreign policy, because while swords might win battles, paperwork wins empires, or at least makes taxes a lot easier. But with these alliances came danger. Every foreign tie risked pulling a kingdom into bigger conflicts. Baekje's closeness with Japan gave it military muscle, but it also made it dependent, a fact that Silla and Goguryeo never failed to exploit. Goguryeo's skirmishes with China brought glory at times, but also devastating invasions. And Silla's eventual pact with Tang China would prove both a lifeline and a headache. It's one thing to invite the dragon into your backyard, quite another to convince it to leave afterward. Diplomacy in this period was like juggling flaming torches while standing on a horse. You had to look impressive, keep your balance, and not catch fire. Envoys travelled across seas and mountains carrying gifts, silks, horses, rare metals, and came back with promises that were sometimes honoured, sometimes forgotten the moment they left the throne room. For ordinary people, these alliances meant new ideas and goods arriving in markets, exotic fabrics, strange spices, bronze mirrors from China, lacquerware from Japan. Suddenly the peninsula was buzzing with foreign treasures, but they also meant foreign soldiers occasionally marching through fields that once only knew ploughs. It was a double-edged sword, quite literally. As wars continued, the three kingdoms became entangled in webs of diplomacy that stretched far beyond Korea. They were no longer just fighting each other. They were fighting as pawns and partners in a much larger game. And as we'll soon see, these foreign ties could make or break a kingdom. Because in the grand drama of the three kingdoms, no one fought alone. Let's pause the drums of war for a moment and take a peek into what life was actually like for the people who lived under Baekje, Goguryeo, and Silla. Because while kings were plotting alliances and generals were sharpening swords, ordinary folks were mostly trying to farm, eat, avoid taxes, and maybe not get caught in the middle of a raid. You know, the usual "please just let me survive" type of life. Daily life in the three kingdoms was built around agriculture. Rice paddies and millet fields stretched across valleys tended by peasants who rose before the sun and worked until dusk. In Goguryeo's colder north, millet and barley were more common. Baekje, with its milder climate, became famous for rice, and Silla balanced between both. Farmers relied on wooden ploughs pulled by oxen, irrigation canals, and a lot of sweat. Imagine hoeing the same patch of dirt day after day, while nobles were debating which dynasty to bribe. It wasn't glamorous, but it kept everyone alive. Clothing was simple for commoners: hemp tunics, trousers, straw sandals. Nobles, of course, looked far more stylish: bright silks, flowing robes, hairpins of jade and gold. They made sure everyone knew who had the power. Baekje artisans were especially admired for their jewelry, producing delicate gold crowns and earrings so intricate that modern jewelers still scratch their heads at the craftsmanship. Meanwhile, peasants wore whatever didn't fall apart. After a few seasons, religion and philosophy shaped daily routines too. Shamanistic practices remained strong, with rituals to appease mountain spirits, river gods, and ancestors. But Buddhism was on the rise, spreading first through Goguryeo, then Baekje, and finally Silla. Temples began to dot the landscape, monks travelled teaching doctrines, and people started chanting sutras alongside making offerings of rice wine. It's almost like a cultural remix, old spirits and new Buddhas coexisting side by side. One strange but delightful detail: Baekje monks reportedly introduced Buddhist art and architecture to Japan, including temple designs. Some sources even claim that Baekje sent over a sacred pagoda model made out of wood, like an ancient IKEA kit. Here's your pagoda starter set. Just add nails and devotion. Historians still debate how much Japan relied on Baekje for its early Buddhist culture, but the influence is undeniable. Food was hearty and practical. Barley porridge, rice cakes, fermented soybean paste, and lots of vegetables formed the backbone of meals. Meat was rare for commoners, though nobles feasted on pork, beef, and game. Fermentation was everywhere: soybeans, fish, even pickled greens. So yes, if you love kimchi today, you might want to thank the ingenuity of early Korean cooks. The only problem? No refrigerators, so people relied on storage pits, jars buried underground, and the occasional cold mountain stream. Basically, the original eco-friendly kitchen. Education was another dividing line. Nobles in Goguryeo had access to state-run schools where they studied Confucian classics, military strategy, and administration. Silla's Hwarang, the elite youth corps, trained in martial arts, music, and poetry, a mix of soldier boot camp and boy band training program. Ordinary farmers, of course, didn't get such luxuries. Their curriculum was plant in spring, harvest in autumn, and pray that tax collectors didn't take too much. Markets were lively spots. Merchants sold pottery, woven cloth, bronze, mirrors, and imported luxuries. Silla's capital, Gyeongju, became particularly vibrant, eventually known as a city of gold, with bustling streets and grand temples. But trade was always shadowed by war. Caravans could bring prosperity or be plundered by raiding parties. Imagine saving up to buy a fine Chinese lacquer bowl, only to see it smashed by a passing soldier the next week. Talk about bad timing. Humorously, one record suggests that Goguryeo kings were so proud of their hunting skills that they often staged massive hunts, inviting nobles to chase deer and boar across the mountains. These hunts were part sport, part training, and part "look how
manly I am."
Yet, to the peasants watching their crops trampled by royal horses, it probably looked less impressive. Historians still debate whether everyday people actually embraced Buddhism wholeheartedly, or if it remained a religion of the elite for centuries. Archaeological evidence shows temples and statues popping up, but household shrines with simple spirit offerings continued well into the later periods. In other words, peasants covered their bases, pray to Buddha for enlightenment, but also keep the mountain god happy in case your cow goes missing. So while kings dreamed of conquest, most Koreans dreamed of good harvests, a warm fire, and maybe a bowl of rice that wasn't watered down to soup. The clash of kingdoms shaped the borders, but it was the ordinary lives of farmers, artisans, and monks that gave these societies their soul. And as the wars dragged on, it was often these very people, the ones ploughing, weaving, and praying, who paid the heaviest price. By the middle of the 6th century, the balance of power began to tilt, slowly but steadily, towards Silla. At first glance, this might have seemed improbable. After all, Silla had once been considered the least sophisticated of the three kingdoms, hemmed in by Baekje to the west and Goguryeo to the north. But, like that quiet student in class who suddenly aces the exam, Silla began surprising everyone with its growing influence. One major reason was geography. Silla occupied the southeastern corner of the peninsula, a land surrounded by mountains and seas. While this made expansion tricky at first, it also offered protection. Invasions from Goguryeo or Baekje often had to squeeze through narrow valleys or risk long marches over rugged terrain. Basically, if you wanted to attack Silla, you'd need good boots and even better patience. But Silla wasn't just hiding behind rocks, it was innovating. Its government structure grew more sophisticated, gradually centralizing power under the king. Local chieftains, once semi-independent, were brought firmly under royal control. The famous bone rank system crystallized during this period, a rigid social hierarchy that dictated not just politics, but even what kind of house you could live in and what size of cart you could ride. Yes, your social status literally determined your driveway size. Militarily, Silla developed into a disciplined force. Its Hwarang, the elite youth corps, became legendary, not just for martial training, but also for their combination of Confucian ethics, Buddhist values, and, oddly enough, a love for poetry and music. Imagine warrior poets who could recite verses while swinging swords. It sounds unusual, but the Hwarang gave Silla both capable commanders and a strong cultural identity. A strange detail that pops up. Some records suggest the Hwarang sometimes adorned themselves with flowers in their hair during training and ceremonies. That might sound more like a spring festival than boot camp, but it symbolized their harmony with nature and ideals of beauty. Picture a group of heavily armed young men charging into battle while sporting daisy crowns. Not the most intimidating look, but apparently effective. Silla's growing power also came from diplomacy. Kings of Silla realized that alliances could be as sharp as swords. They began courting ties with China, particularly with the rising Sui, and later Tang dynasties. Through these connections, Silla imported not only military technologies, but also advanced bureaucratic models and Buddhist practices. In a way, Silla played the role of the networker kingdom, smiling politely, sending tribute, and making sure it had powerful friends abroad. Meanwhile, Baekje and Goguryeo were showing cracks. Baekje's kings struggled to keep aristocrats in line, and Goguryeo was beginning to feel the weight of defending its vast northern borders against Chinese dynasties. Silla, smaller and more compact, didn't have to spread itself as thin. This gave it room to maneuver like a nimble dancer among clumsy giants. One humorous oddity: Silla kings occasionally sent exotic gifts to China, including peacocks and unusual local products. Imagine the Tang Emperor receiving a royal care package from Korea, complete with fancy feathers and jars of fermented fish. Diplomacy smelled a little fishy, but it worked. Historians still debate whether Silla's bone rank system strengthened or weakened it in the long run. On the one hand, it created order and hierarchy. On the other, it locked society into rigid divisions that could stifle innovation. But during this period, it helped the monarchy consolidate power, giving Silla a level of internal stability its rivals often lacked. By the late 6th century, Silla was no longer the underdog. Its kings, like Jinhung, expanded territory and built monumental projects. Fortresses lined its borders, temples rose within its heartland, and the kingdom started to project confidence. It was as if Silla had finally stepped out of the shadows, ready to play on the same stage as Baekje and Goguryeo, and maybe even outshine them. The tide was turning, and the once quiet kingdom was about to become the loudest voice in the peninsula's song of war. By the 7th century, Silla's ambition had grown too large for the peninsula to contain. Its kings looked north and west, eyeing the territories of Baekje and Goguryeo, but they knew direct conquest would be risky. So Silla did something brilliant. It made friends with the biggest kid on the block, Tang China. The Silla-Tang alliance was not just about handshakes and polite letters. It was a strategic partnership that would change Korean history. Around 618, the Tang dynasty had emerged in China, replacing the short-lived Sui. The Tang emperors were powerful, ambitious, and eager to expand their influence. Silla saw this as an opportunity. Why fight Baekje and Goguryeo alone when you could bring in an empire with shiny armor and endless supplies? The alliance began through careful diplomacy. Silla sent envoys, gifts, and pledges of loyalty, assuring Tang China that it was a reliable partner. Tang emperors, always fond of adding loyal tributaries to their list, were flattered. They even gave Silla kings impressive-sounding Chinese titles, basically honorary job promotions from another country. Imagine being the CEO of a small startup and suddenly getting an honorary award from Apple, prestige guaranteed. Of course, not everyone in Silla was thrilled. Some nobles worried that too much Chinese influence would dilute their own traditions. After all, Silla already borrowed heavily from China: Confucian bureaucracy, Tang-style clothing, and Buddhist temple designs. There was a lingering fear that Silla might become a puppet state. But the kings calculated that survival and victory were worth the risk. Meanwhile, Baekje and Goguryeo reacted with alarm. Baekje, under its later kings, scrambled to strengthen ties with Japan, hoping the island kingdom could counterbalance the Tang threat. Goguryeo, fierce and proud, braced for confrontation, reinforcing its northern fortresses. Both kingdoms accused Silla of betraying Korean unity, though in truth all three had been plotting against each other for centuries. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some chronicles note that Silla envoys in Tang China were sometimes overwhelmed by the scale of Chang'an, the Tang capital. For visitors used to Gyeongju's elegant but smaller palaces, Chang'an must have felt like stepping into a bustling galaxy of trade, culture, and bureaucracy. Rumor has it that one envoy even got lost for days in the maze of streets. Diplomatic missions back then clearly required both maps and stamina. The Silla-Tang alliance wasn't just political, it had a cultural glow-up effect too. Chinese Buddhist monks travelled to Silla, bringing new scriptures and artistic styles. Tang craftsmen introduced refined techniques in ceramics, architecture, and even music. Silla's court became more cosmopolitan, blending its local traditions with Tang sophistication. Imagine Gyeongju hosting something like an ancient version of a K-pop and Tang opera fusion concert. Not exactly chart-topping, but culturally impressive. Militarily, the alliance gave Silla a decisive edge. With Tang troops and ships potentially at its disposal, Silla could aim higher than ever before. The kingdom didn't have to rely solely on its own manpower. It could call upon a superpower. It was like signing a military pact with the Avengers, minus the capes. Still, historians debate the sincerity of Tang's intentions. Was Tang really invested in helping Silla, or did it simply want a foothold in Korea? Some argue that Tang hoped to directly control the peninsula, with Silla as a convenient junior partner. Others believe Tang simply wanted stability on its eastern border and saw Silla as the best bet. Either way, the partnership was born of mutual convenience more than true friendship. In Silla's eyes, however, the path was clear. With Tang's support, it could finally crush Baekje and Goguryeo and unify the peninsula under its own crown. The alliance was like loading a slingshot with a much bigger rock, dangerous but potentially game-changing. By the late 640s, plans were already in motion. Silla kings prepared for joint campaigns with Tang, while Baekje and Goguryeo braced for the storm. The stage was set for a showdown unlike anything Korea had seen before. The year was 6060, and Baekje stood on the edge of disaster. For centuries it had thrived as a maritime kingdom, trading with Japan and dazzling the peninsula with its culture, but now it faced its greatest trial, the combined might of Silla and Tang. The invasion began with terrifying efficiency. The Tang Emperor sent a fleet of ships across the Yellow Sea, packed with soldiers in gleaming armor. At the same time, Silla's forces, led by General Kim Yu-sin, yes, the same military genius we met earlier, advanced by land. Together they formed a pincer that pressed Baekje from both directions. It was like being attacked by a bear, in a front and a tiger behind, with nowhere to run. Baekje's king, Baekje, was unprepared for such overwhelming force. Though Baekje had brave warriors and fortified cities, it could not withstand the sheer scale of the Allied assault. Battles erupted along the rivers and plains, with Baekje's defenders desperately trying to hold their ground. Some records describe the sight of Tang warships lined along the riverbanks like an endless wall of wood and steel, a sight that must have drained the courage from even the bravest soldier. One curious note. Despite his role in leading Baekje during this crisis, King Baekje was remembered less for strategy and more for his indulgent lifestyle. Chronicles accuse him of enjoying too much wine and pleasure at a time when his kingdom desperately needed focus. Was that entirely true, or simply propaganda written by his enemies? Historians still debate whether King Goguryeo was truly negligent or unfairly blamed for circumstances beyond his control. As the Allied armies pressed deeper, the Baekje capital, Sabi, became the ultimate target. The city was beautiful, with elegant palaces and temples, but beauty does not stop catapults. When Silla and Tang forces arrived, the defenders resisted fiercely, yet their numbers dwindled quickly. Panic spread among the citizens, and some even attempted to flee toward Japan, hoping to find refuge across the sea. There's a darkly humorous tale told in later folklore. As Baekje soldiers scrambled to prepare defenses, one official supposedly ordered that precious wine jars be hidden underground, thinking they might survive the sack of the city. When archaeologists later uncovered some of these jars, they discovered only shards. Apparently, even in defeat, Baekje's defenders were thirsty. The fall of Sabi was swift and devastating. King Goguryeo surrendered, and thousands of Baekje nobles and officials were captured. Some were exiled to Tang, China, where they lived out their days in quiet obscurity. Others were executed. The kingdom that had once spread its influence across the seas and dazzled Japan with its culture was reduced to ashes almost overnight. Yet, the story of Baekje did not end there. Loyalists refused to accept defeat. In particular, a group of nobles rallied under a general named Baekje and the prince Pung. With help from Japan, they tried to restore the kingdom. Japan, deeply tied to Baekje through cultural and family connections, sent ships and soldiers to support this resistance. The stage was set for one last desperate gamble. At the Battle of Baekje in 663, Baekje loyalists and Japanese allies clashed with Silla Tang forces in one of the largest naval battles in East Asian history. Wooden warships rammed into one another, arrows filled the sky, and the river turned into chaos. In the end, the alliance of Silla and Tang crushed their enemies, sinking hundreds of Japanese ships. It was a disaster for Baekje loyalists and a humiliation for Japan. Baekje's dream of revival sank with those ships. After the battle, the resistance collapsed, and Baekje disappeared as an independent kingdom. Its people were absorbed into Silla and Tang rule, though fragments of Baekje culture lived on in temples, art, and even in Japan, where its influence had already taken root. Oddly enough, Baekje's fall left behind a curious legacy. Japanese chronicles speak of craftsmen, scholars, and monks from Baekje who fled across the sea after the kingdom's collapse. They carried with them knowledge of architecture, Buddhism, and governance, shaping Japanese culture for centuries. So, in a strange way, Baekje's defeat became Japan's cultural victory. But for the Korean peninsula, the balance of power had shifted dramatically. Baekje, the seafaring kingdom, was gone. Only Goguryeo remained as a rival to Silla. The war for unification was far from over, but now it was a duel between two giants. With Baekje gone, the stage narrowed to a final showdown: Silla versus Goguryeo. And if Baekje had been known for culture and seafaring, Goguryeo was famous for sheer stubborn toughness. Its mountains, fortresses, and warriors had resisted wave after wave of invaders from Han Dynasty armies to the fearsome nomads of the north. For centuries, Goguryeo had been the wall of Korea, standing tall against the world. But by the late 7th century, cracks had begun to show. The Tang dynasty, emboldened by its success against Baekje, turned its attention northward. Emperor Gaozong was determined to bring Goguryeo under his sway. But he was not the first to try. Remember, even the mighty Emperor Yang of Sui had once sent 1,000,000 men against Goguryeo and returned in humiliation. So the Tang knew this would not be easy. That's why Silla's alliance was essential. Silla's general Kim Yusin, who by now was probably running out of room on his shelf for all the victory medals he deserved, prepared once again to march. He had grown into a legend in his own lifetime, and with Baekje defeated, he turned his gaze toward Goguryeo's strongholds. For the Silla-Tang alliance, this was not just another war. It was the final step toward shaping the future of the peninsula. Inside Goguryeo, things were far from stable. The kingdom was torn by internal strife. The death of the great general Yeongesomun, who had ruled with an iron fist, left behind a fractured leadership. His sons fought among themselves, each claiming authority. Nothing says welcome invaders like a messy family feud right before the enemy shows up. Historians still debate whether Goguryeo might have survived longer if Yeongesomun had lived just a few more years. In 668, the decisive campaign began. Tang armies, reinforced by Silla troops, advanced from multiple directions. Fortress after fortress fell, though not without resistance. Goguryeo's soldiers fought like wolves cornered in their dens, but they were outnumbered and outmaneuvered. One odd detail preserved in the chronicles describes how some Goguryeo defenders supposedly used flaming carts filled with hay, sending them rolling downhill into enemy camps at night. Did it work? Maybe once or twice, but it wasn't enough to stop the tide. The final blow came at the capital, Pyongyang. Tang generals, with Silla's assistance, laid siege to the city. The defenders held out as long as they could, but famine and exhaustion gnawed at their strength. Chronicles describe families boiling tree bark into soup and soldiers gnawing leather straps to quiet their hunger. And yet, still they resisted because surrender was unthinkable for a kingdom that had prided itself on centuries of defiance. At last, Pyongyang fell. The Tang armies entered the city, and Goguryeo, the fortress kingdom of the north, ceased to exist as an independent state. The capture of the royal family and the collapse of the ruling elite sealed its fate. The mighty kingdom that had once terrified Chinese dynasties and held back armies many times its size was finally extinguished. But here's a strange twist. Many commoners and local leaders in Goguryeo didn't simply vanish into Tang control. Rebellions and resistance movements flared up almost immediately after the conquest. Some historians even suggest that the stubborn independence of Goguryeo's people later influenced the rise of Baekje, a successor state that emerged in the north. So, in a way, Goguryeo's spirit refused to die. There's even a lighter, if slightly ironic, anecdote. Some Tang officials complained bitterly about how expensive it was to occupy Goguryeo. Supposedly, one frustrated governor joked that it would have been cheaper to just build a wall and keep Goguryeo out rather than spend endless money trying to govern it. Of course, this is the same civilization that actually did build the Great Wall, so maybe he wasn't entirely joking. For Silla, the fall of Goguryeo was both a triumph and a new challenge. With Baekje and Goguryeo gone, Silla stood as the only Korean kingdom left, but it was still shackled by its alliance with Tang. The Tang emperor, unsurprisingly, was not about to pack up his armies and leave after all that effort. No, he intended to turn both Baekje and Goguryeo lands into Tang protectorates. Silla suddenly found itself staring at the awkward situation of having fought alongside a powerful empire, only to realize that empire wanted to swallow the very prize Silla had hoped to claim. It was like inviting a friend to help move furniture and then realizing he just carried off your sofa and half your kitchen. But that story belongs to the next chapter. For now, Goguryeo, the proud northern giant, had fallen. The Korean peninsula was forever changed, but the fight for true independence and Silla's dream of unification was only beginning. So, Silla had done the impossible. With Tang's help, it had crushed both Baekje and Goguryeo. You'd think that would be the moment when everyone clapped, the credits rolled, and Silla's king got a shiny crown labeled Unifier of Korea. But no, history rarely gives you a clean ending. Instead, what followed was, well, awkward. See, Tang China had invested heavily in these campaigns. Troops, supplies, ships, and probably more bureaucratic paperwork than any sane person would want to imagine. Naturally, Tang expected a reward, but while Silla dreamed of uniting the peninsula under its own banner, Tang dreamed of turning the conquered territories into Chinese protectorates. And guess what? Both dreams couldn't exist at the same time. Tang quickly set up command posts in former Baekje and Goguryeo lands, treating them as new Tang provinces. Governors were appointed, tax collectors sent out, and Chinese garrisons built fortresses. To Silla's horror, Tang even established something called the Protectorate General to pacify the East, which, spoiler alert, was not meant to make Silla feel comfortable. King Munmu of Silla suddenly realized he had gone from grateful ally to potential target. Silla's elite must have looked at each other and thought, wait a second, did we just help Tang conquer ourselves? Historians still debate whether Tang ever truly intended to let Silla have the peninsula, or if the alliance was always just a clever trick. Tensions escalated quickly. By 670, open conflict broke out between Tang forces and Silla troops, and this time the battlefield was no longer against Baekje or Goguryeo. It was against their former ally. Talk about a messy breakup. The Silla-Tang War dragged on for years, marked by sieges, ambushes, and shifting control of territories. General Kim Yu-sin once again stepped forward as the hero of Silla, organizing resistance against Tang armies that often outnumbered his own. It was like déjà vu for him, fighting a giant empire with fewer resources, using cunning and persistence to survive. One famous episode describes how Silla forces managed to ambush Tang reinforcements along the Taedong River, using the terrain. To their advantage, they surprised the enemy and cut off their supply lines. The victory wasn't massive in scale, but it boosted morale and proved that Silla wasn't going to roll over quietly. Meanwhile, in the north, remnants of Goguryeo populations were still resisting Tang rule. Small revolts kept flaring up, forcing Tang to divert energy and manpower just to keep control. Imagine trying to host a banquet while squirrels keep sneaking in through the roof and stealing your food. It was that kind of headache. And here's an odd detail. Some chronicles mention that Silla fighters spread rumors claiming Tang soldiers were cursed if they fought too long on Korean soil. Whether people believed it or not, it made for excellent psychological warfare. Superstition could sometimes shake an army more than actual weapons. The war dragged into the 60s-70s, wearing down both sides. For Tang, Korea became an expensive drain with little to show for it. For Silla, the fight was desperate but deeply motivated by survival. The more Silla resisted, the clearer it became that Tang couldn't just install its governors and call it a day. By 676, after nearly a decade of struggle, Tang forces finally retreated from the Korean peninsula, except for some footholds in the far north. Silla had achieved what seemed unthinkable. It had defeated not only Baekje and Goguryeo, but also pushed back the mighty Tang dynasty itself. This was the moment King Munmu had dreamed of. For the first time, much of the Korean peninsula was united under one kingdom, Silla. Of course, it wasn't a perfect unification. Northern regions once belonging to Goguryeo remained under Tang influence and later became part of the new kingdom of Baekje. But still, within the boundaries Silla controlled, this was unprecedented. And in one of history's odd little footnotes, King Munmu was so committed to protecting his unified land that he asked on his deathbed to have his ashes scattered in the sea. He believed his spirit would transform into a dragon that would guard Korea's shores. It's probably the coolest "I'll be back" line a monarch has ever left behind. So, by the late 7th century, the long war of the three kingdoms had ended, not with a clean handshake, but with blood, betrayal, and stubborn resistance. Silla had risen from underdog to master of the peninsula, while Baekje and Goguryeo had been swept into history. And Tang, for all its power, had been taught a lesson. Korea was not a land that could be ruled easily. Of course, that doesn't mean peace was guaranteed forever. But for now, Silla could breathe, stand tall, and declare itself the kingdom of a unified Korea, at least in spirit. With Tang finally pushed back, Silla found itself in a position no Korean kingdom had ever held before, most of the peninsula under one banner. The war drums quieted, and suddenly the kingdom had to shift gears from constant survival mode to the challenge of governance. And honestly, that might have been the harder task because, think about it, 3 cultures, 3 rival kingdoms, 3 proud peoples, all crammed under the Silla umbrella. It was like trying to combine 3 different family recipes into one dish and pretending it tasted better. Spoiler: not everyone was thrilled about this unification. The conquered territories of Baekje and Goguryeo had long traditions of their own, with elites who resented being ruled by Silla. Some fled to Tang-controlled areas or even joined the emerging state of Baekje in the north, which carried on much of Goguryeo's legacy. Others stayed, but resisted quietly, undermining Silla's efforts whenever possible. Historians still debate whether these internal tensions ever truly healed or whether Silla was always balancing on a political tightrope. Yet for all the difficulties, unified Silla, yes, that's what historians call it, did achieve something remarkable. With the wars finally over, resources that once went to soldiers and swords could now go to building temples, schools, and roads. Buddhism especially flourished. Monks travelled between Korea, China, and even India, carrying not just religious texts, but also new ideas in art, architecture, and philosophy. One of the most stunning achievements of this era was the construction of Bulguksa Temple and the nearby Seokguram Grotto. Imagine a magnificent stone Buddha gazing calmly out to the sea, carved so skillfully that even modern architects shake their heads in awe. And here's the odd detail. Legend says that if you listen closely on a quiet night, you can still hear the chisels of ancient stonemasons echoing through the grotto. Ghost construction crew, anyone? But while temples rose and learning spread, Silla's leadership knew it couldn't just coast on spiritual vibes. Administration became critical. Officials had to manage taxes, rebuild war-torn regions, and keep the aristocracy from tearing each other apart. The bone rank system, the rigid hierarchy Silla was famous for, now stretched across the new territory, and not everyone liked where they ended up on the social ladder. Still, there was a sense of pride. For the first time, the Korean peninsula had something close to a shared identity. The wars of Baekje, Goguryeo, and Silla had shaped a collective memory, a story that would be told and retold for centuries. 3 rivals, endless struggle, and finally, one kingdom prevailing. You can almost hear ancient parents telling their kids, "Back in my day, we fought off the Chinese Empire and 3 kingdoms at once." And let's not forget the humor of hindsight. Somewhere in Silla's court, an advisor must have joked, "We teamed up with Tang to defeat Baekje and Goguryeo, then defeated Tang too. So technically we beat everybody, including ourselves." Sometimes history has a way of making kingdoms look like bad roommates in a long-running reality show. Meanwhile, up north, the story wasn't entirely finished. Baekje had risen, claiming to be the successor of Goguryeo. For nearly 3 centuries, Baekje would thrive in the north, while unified Silla controlled the south. This meant that unification was more of a half-win than the total package Silla might have boasted about. Still, within the boundaries it held, Silla brought stability and cultural brilliance that would leave deep marks on Korean history. The people themselves, farmers, craftsmen, scholars, and monks, must have felt a strange mixture of relief and uncertainty. No more armies stomping through their fields, but new rulers and stricter hierarchies to adapt to. And yet with peace came festivals, markets, and the slow rebuilding of lives. Somewhere in a small village, a farmer probably leaned back, looked at his rebuilt rice paddies, and muttered, "Finally, I can worry about weather instead of soldiers." And historians agree, those years after the wars may not have been free of strife, but they laid the groundwork for the golden age of unified Silla, an age of cultural flourishing that the old warriors of the battlefield could hardly have imagined. But the story wasn't done just yet. because when the dust of war finally settled, people still wondered, what did it all mean? What legacy would remain after centuries of fighting, scheming, and conquering? The wars had ended, the kingdoms had fallen, and Silla now stood as the sole ruler of much of the peninsula. But history, of course, is never as clean-cut as the victorious like to write it down. Unified Silla's legacy was complicated. On one hand, it was a triumph. After centuries of endless battles, invasions, betrayals, and shifting alliances, there was finally a single power overseeing most of Korea. That alone was a feat worth singing about in poems and carving into stone. Yet, on the other hand, unification brought as many challenges as it solved. Cultural differences lingered between the peoples of Baekje, Goguryeo, and Silla. Many Goguryeo nobles resented being ruled by what they saw as a smaller, weaker kingdom. Baekje's lands still whispered with memories of grandeur, their artisans and scholars reminding everyone that their culture had been rich long before Silla's armies arrived. And in the north, Baekje rose like a phoenix, carrying on Goguryeo's proud traditions beyond Silla's reach. So perhaps the peninsula wasn't as unified as the name suggested. Historians still debate whether the term Unified Silla is more of a convenient label than an actual reality. Still, the age of Silla brought undeniable brilliance. Buddhism reached dazzling new heights, shaping art and architecture in ways that continue to awe visitors today. Stone pagodas stood tall
against the sky, their lines sharp and clean, while bronze bells rang with clarity across valleys.
The monks' teachings reached every corner of society, from farmers seeking comfort to aristocrats pondering the meaning of life. But of course, even the Golden Age had its shadows. Aristocratic power remained entrenched through the bone rank system, leaving little room for social mobility. Farmers bore heavy burdens, their harvests sustaining not just their families, but entire courts and temples. And court politics, well, let's just say it was like a never-ending soap opera filled with rivalries, alliances, and the occasional betrayal over tea. One official might smile politely in the morning, only to be plotting someone's downfall by nightfall. And yet, through all of this, something remarkable had happened. A sense of shared identity began to take shape. For the first time, people across the peninsula could look at one another and say, "We belong to the same story." The struggles, the sacrifices, the triumphs, all of them wove together into a narrative that future generations would carry. It's worth pausing to imagine the ordinary people of that time. After centuries of war, a child born in unified Silla might never see battle firsthand. They might instead grow up listening to their grandparents' tales of fire and steel, shaking their heads at the absurdity of it all while enjoying peace and stability. Perhaps they sat beneath the glow of an oil lamp, hearing stories of kings, generals, and gods, while outside the cicadas sang into the night. And isn't that, in a way, the true reward of history's struggles? Not just the monuments or the titles of kings, but the chance for ordinary people to live quietly, to farm, to love, to dream. So as we close the story of Baekje, Goguryeo, and Silla, let's ease into something softer. Tonight, the war drums are finally silent. The banners are folded away. The clashing of swords has faded into memory. Now picture a gentle breeze drifting over the green hills of the peninsula. Rice paddies shimmer under the moonlight, reflecting stars like tiny lanterns.
Scattered across the water.
In the distance, a temple bell tolls once, low and calm, carrying through the valley as if to remind everyone that peace, however fragile, has been won for now. A farmer sits on his porch, sipping from a clay cup, grateful for the quiet. Children chase fireflies in the fields, laughing, their voices mingling with the sound of crickets, and somewhere in a distant monastery a monk closes his eyes in meditation, knowing that while empires may rise and fall, the human desire for harmony endures. So as you drift towards sleep, let the story fade like an echo across the centuries. The warriors have laid down their arms. The kings have taken their place in history. The peninsula rests under the calm gaze of the moon, wrapped in a fragile but comforting silence. May your own night be just as peaceful, free of battles, filled instead with the soft rhythm of dreams. Rest well, for tomorrow always carries its own challenges, but tonight belongs to quiet.